to get more into podcasting, because I think there's a lot of people that know about podcasts, there's a lot of people that listen to podcasts, but it's not, super easy to understand what goes into a podcast unless you're doing it. At least that's my opinion. So what are some of the misconceptions about podcasting? People come to you, potential customers, and they say one thing, and really you hear it, but it means something else, or what are those types of moments?
Yeah, so there's a few basic ones. There's the classic "if you build it, they will come" kind of mentality of, well, all I have to do is put an audio out there and then I'll have an audience all of a sudden. And that doesn't work for anything, podcasting or YouTube or blogging or anything, Pretty much any style of content creation, you need to market the content itself and promote the content itself. Because if you're starting without an audience, starting a podcast won't automatically give you an audience. So there's that general misconception. But that doesn't mean that it's difficult to grow one. It just takes a little bit of effort. So that's one. The other one is that really a lot of people think if I start a business or a podcast for my business, then it'll be too salesy, or it'll be too full of marketing message. And what's funny about that to me is any podcast that's super salesy just doesn't work, because listeners don't stick around and listen to more episodes. If it's a sales pitch the whole time, nobody's interested. But if you're already concerned about that, that's perfect, because then the type of content you want to create will not be super salesy, because you're kind of trying to avoid being super salesy anyways.
Right.
So what ends up working really well with podcasting is putting together content that is a great free resource for the audience. So that could be either it's educational, so something that somebody tunes into specifically to learn and grow in an area, or it's story and human interest based, to where, and again, this isn't going to be in a specific topic, but there's a real human connection that happens there. So there's a combination of entertainment and topic interest. And then the way that podcast marketing tends to work is within an episode, there should be a strong call to action for people who are the right fit to work with whoever the host is in whether they've got a product, a service, a SaaS app, or whatever. There should be a very easy next step that addresses a problem or a challenge that a good customer for them would have. So a perfect example is we have a client that he has a podcast that helps financial advisors break out of working with firms and go out on their own and start their own company. So their podcast, they interview financial advisors who broke out and built their own company.
Right.
And so they kind of combine the two elements, because they get the story and they get kind of this audio interview case study, but it's also super applicable,
Right.
specifically to people who want to do it on their own. So they get to hear the stories of all these other people who have done it, and really the trials and tribulations, how it's not all sunshine and roses. The first couple of years, a lot of times for these interviews, are pretty rough. But every time, if he asks, at some point he usually asks if they're happy that they, with where they are now, and almost without a doubt, they're like, yeah, I'm really glad that I went out on my own. So anyways, within his episodes, he always has this little segment to where he talks about this free packet that if somebody's works in a firm and they've been considering going out on their own, this is what a roadmap looks like for somebody who typically goes out on their own. So it's this free thing that's super, it's almost something that the listener is entitled to if they want it, but there's no sales pitch around it. There's no hey, we created this free resource, you can go grab it here. And usually it's an email opt-in. So it's real low key. so that's the only like selling that ever happens in an episode. And so that's when, you know, folks are concerned about being too salesy. That's what works, is having stories and education, and then having a very low commitment next step tool or resource or offer for people. And that then builds so much trust, because if you think about it, if you've been listening to, let's say, a podcast host who's been putting out episodes every week, and they have this free resource for you, you've been hearing about it every episode, and you know, you've been hearing educational content or story content that they're putting out, and they have this easy thing that helps you take the next step. And if that's actually helpful for you, then if you're looking to work with somebody to go further, they're a natural shoe-in. You've already built trust. You already get to hear their voice in the episodes, hear how they talk to other people, hear how they think. So a lot of times, what we hear from our clients, and I've experienced this myself, once somebody gets to a point where they're interested in working with you, they kind of already know you pretty well. Right. Like if you show up to a like a big conference or something, you'll get people walking up to you, talking to you as a friend, and you're like, I've never met you before. I'm Ben. Nice to meet you. But they'll talk to you like they know, and they do know you. They've heard about your cat. They've heard about, you know, that time that you were sick and you were still interviewing people, right, or whatever. So it really builds a lot of trust and connection without having, you know, a million one-to-one phone calls.
Right. And podcasting gets really emotional, or it can, I guess.
Very much can.
If the, I'm thinking about it now, if you're telling stories in a way that's effective, a lot of people get emotional, and that's why I could see so many people are like connected to you through this podcast, even though you've never met.
Totally. And I think the one other misconception, and this is a quick one, but a lot of people think, well, I'm going to be a horrible interviewer. I've never interviewed before. The biggest thing that I always help people understand is if you are just curious on behalf of your audience, if you know like what your audience is kind of interested in, and you're curious and you ask questions that you know they would want to know the answers to, you're good to go. That's all an interviewer ever does. That's all a good interviewer ever does. So especially if you are your own audience, if you are like the types of clients you serve or the types of audience that you want to build are people similar to you, just ask questions that you want to know yourself,
right,
and that will naturally translate.
Perfect. All right, the big question is, who do you think, in your opinion, should really be starting a podcast?
It is the people that stand to gain the most from starting a podcast are somebody who owns a small business, or you know, a team member at a small business that they know exactly who their audience is. They have a product or service that already sells to that audience. You know, they kind of have a niche figured out. They have products or services that already sell to that niche, and they're ready to scale up and bring in more customers and build a bigger audience around that brand. Where a lot of people try to start a show, and it can be challenging, is when you don't have an audience nailed down yet and you're trying to figure out who your audience is. Because if you start with kind of a real broad type show, usually that's a recipe for not really appealing to anybody in particular. So usually with podcasting, you want to be very specific about who your audience is and who the show is for, because otherwise, you know, there's so many shows at this point that there's just so many options. Mm-hmm. So you kind of need to be a little bit more specific. So I always think about you have a product or service that already sells, so it's a proven product. You have an audience already figured out, and you're kind of ready to scale that up and grow an audience around that business. And you intend for that business and that same offer to, you know, still be in operation 3 years from now. Because podcasting isn't a 1 month long game. You know, usually you're building the brand over time. So that's where there's the most opportunity, for sure.
Right. It's not really a good hobby.
It can be. Just know that it's a hobby, you know, because anybody can start a show.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, like, particular, like if you want to see ROI from a podcast, or you want to generate tangible marketing results, that's kind of what I've been talking about. If you want to start a show about puppies, just go ahead and start a show about puppies.